Hey there, today we're going to be taking a look at the performance of the Ryzen 5 5600H in this Beelink SER5 mini PC. Now, I've had this mini PC for quite a while now, and I have been using it a lot, but I've never done a full comprehensive list of different games running on there so you can get a relative idea of what the performance is like. Now, so far, as of recently, I've taken a look at the Trig key at the SRE5 with the 5560U and the Beelink SER6 with the 6600H. So now we're going to be taking a look at the SRE5 with the 5600H, and the real competitors for it are the SRE5 with the 5560U and the Ryzen 5 5500U. Reason being is that these are all the same chassis for the most part, and in general the specs are very similar to each other with just slight variations amongst each configuration. Now, of course, these aren't the only things that compete with it within its price range. There is, of course, the Ryzen 5 5600U, which is just the lower power version of this, and we are going to do a comparison later on just between the two to see what a higher TDP actually nets us here, because on paper they all seem to be almost identical to each other. Now, this video is just going to focus on testing the performance on specifically on the 5600H, but we will do a later video where we're going to compare it against all of the other Ryzen chips that I have. So if you're interested in that, leave a comment down below, as well as letting me know what other systems you would like to see tested out, what specific chips. I'm trying to decide on what the next system I'll buy is going to be, so let me know down below. But let's jump into the performance numbers. So to start off the gaming benchmarks, here we have F122 running on the system right now with the lowest in-game graphics setting, so that is the ultra low graphics preset, and we are using FSR, but it is FSR 1.0 and it's set to the balanced graphics preset for FSR here. So it's not the lowest quality that you can get, but it's certainly not amazing. It's passable enough in a title like this, though. As you can see here, we're actually getting some pretty fantastic levels of performance. We're getting a well above 60 FPS average with 1% lows that don't even dip under 60, which means this is going to be an extremely consistent experience. And visually speaking, while you are taking a hit because you're using FSR with the balanced preset, it's still going to be such a playable experience that I think the smoothness of all of it is just going to outweigh the visual degradation that comes from FSR 1.0 set to balanced. Now, continuing on, taking a look at the different racing games here, we have Dirt 5 running with the lowest in-game graphics settings, but it is set to 100% resolution. By default, if you just go with the ultra low preset, it will actually half the resolution, which does give you a pretty meaningful boost in performance, but you are taking a pretty big visual impact. At 100% resolution, you are at least able to get a very consistent 30 FPS average here, with an actual average of 32, but 1% lows of 29 mean that you're going to be fluctuating around that 30 FPS mark for the most part. Now, whether or not that's good enough for you to play like this is really up to you to decide, but at least for me, it's at least decent enough to get through the game, but I could understand if you want to push this a lot closer towards 60. That said, though, if you go for some older racing titles like Grid 2 here, you can actually play it at 1080p with the highest in-game graphics settings, and you're also able to use some pretty high refresh rate. An FPS average of 100 and 1% lows of 82 pretty much means that we're going to have an absolutely perfect experience here. You could even turn this all the way up to Ultra, though personally I would not recommend not doing that, just because there is really no visual improvement from Ultra, and you would just be losing FPS for no reason. If you have a 60 Hz display, then by all means turn it up, because this extra FPS really isn't doing much of anything for you anyway. But if you have a high refresh rate display, this actually does make the experience of playing racing games in general really nice. Now, moving away from racing games, here we have Crysis 2 Remastered running with the built-in benchmark that looks extremely janky, and the reason being is that this is essentially just the original Crysis's built-in benchmark, which also was very janky back in the day, but just ported over to the updated engine. In general, the level of performance that we're seeing here is not great. Now, this is running with the lowest in-game graphics settings, but when you're actually setting up the benchmark, there is no option to turn off ray tracing. You can only just set it to its lowest preset. So I'm not sure if ray tracing is actually running right now, but in general, the level of performance that we're getting at the full 1080p resolution is pretty abysmal. Now, things do improve when we move over to Hitman, this being the built-in benchmark for Hitman 3. And as you can see, running with the lowest in-game graphics settings, but no FSR turned on at all, we're able to get a very consistent around 30 FPS average with this. 1% lows barely fall underneath that 30 FPS, and our FPS average is at least very close to our 1% lows, which means we'll have a very consistent experience experience here, at least according to the built-in benchmark. While playing the game, I did notice a bit more of an impact to the 1% lows, but not enough to really make the whole experience absolutely unplayable. It's just not ideal. But if we move on to one of the more CPU demanding titles that we're taking a look at here is Mountain Blade 2 Bannerlord running with the lowest in-game graphics settings, and you can see here that our FPS average is not amazing by any means, but our 1% lows are also pretty decent here. It's certainly not going to be an incredible experience by any means, but it is at least going to be somewhat doable here. Well, it's doing slightly better than what we've seen from the 5500U and 5600U. It's nowhere near the level of performance of the 6600H. The next title we're looking at is Borderlands 3 running with the lowest in-game graphics settings here, and as you can see, we're getting a decent enough FPS average, though the 1% lows aren't exactly at the range that I would like them to be. It's still more than adequate enough. And realistically, if you're trying to play this game on here, you could do it at 1080p. I would honestly recommend just dropping to 900p, but if you're not willing to drop the resolution, it is at least still passable. Certainly not an incredible experience, but it is at least decent enough. Now, Rise of the Tomb Raider, even though it is quite a few years old at this point, does seem to struggle to get us anywhere near a decent enough experience here. While the FPS average is adequate enough, it's those 1% lows that really drag things down, and it's the inconsistency of the fluctuations that you see from there that kind of just drag down the whole experience. I would really just say that playing this game on here, it's going to be way too inconsistent that I don't think that you guys would realistically have a good time playing like this unless you're really desperate to play through this game. I would just end up dropping the resolution down to 900p or 720p. Now we'll take a look at a game that has pretty much lived its entire life as just a benchmark. We have Strange Brigade, a game that you probably have only heard about from other tech reviewers out there using it for its built-in benchmark. It's also pretty interesting in the sense that it supports both Vulkan and DirectX 12. It's a nice way of being able to compare the two of them, at least in the implementation in this game. But as you can see here, we get a very consistent FPS average and 1% lows in this game, which means that you're going to have a rock solid experience if you're actually trying to play this game, and I recommend that you do. It's actually a good game. It's not just a benchmark. I promise you, if you play this game, you'll have fun with your friends. That said, a game that I don't think you're going to have any real fun with your friends playing on this system is Ghost Recon Wildlands. While we get a decent enough FPS average of 35, it's those 1% lows dropping all the way down to 20 that kind of just kill the whole experience here. If you drop things down to 900p or down to 720p, you're going to get a far better experience out of this game, but as it stands right now, at the full 1080p resolution, even though this title is quite a few years old now, it's still struggling because it's just an extremely demanding game. That said, though, Rainbow Six Siege, even though it is a few years older, it actually does perform extremely well on here. I think one of the biggest advantages of the 5600H over the 5500U and 5600U is that the higher TDP means that the CPU and GPU don't really need to compete for power. What that ends up actually doing is that both are able to clock up a lot higher. And because of that, we just get very, very consistent 1% lows and averages where there's very little variance between the two. And in general, like a title like this, you end up having a very, very smooth and very consistent experience. But if we hop over to Mafia 2 Definitive Edition, which is just an HD remaster of Mafia 2, you can see here that at the lowest in-game graphics settings, we do get an FPS average of 46 and a 1% low of 34. Certainly passable enough to be a decent experience for the vast majority of people. That being said, if you do want to squeeze out some more performance here, you can always drop down to 900p, and that will boost your FPS average and 1% lows pretty significantly. It's certainly not necessary, but if something that you might want to do if you do not find these 1% lows to be adequate enough for you. I think that around 30 FPS is the bare minimum for 1% lows, but I can totally understand if you're someone that's like, I want 1% lows of a minimum of 45 or something like that. It certainly does make the experience of playing the games noticeably better the higher your 1% lows, and this is getting very close to the edge of what's reasonable. Now the next title we're taking a look at is Batman Arkham Knight, here running with the lowest in-game graphics settings at 1080p. And while we're not getting a high refresh rate here, the fact that those 1% lows are very close to that average does mean that we get a very nice, smooth, enjoyable experience playing this on you. Again, the biggest advantage of the 5600H is just the fact that it has that higher boost clock and it has the higher TDP that lets it pretty much give all the breathing room it needs to the iGPU and the CPU for the most part. Feeding 6 cores that are trying to hit these higher clocks can actually end up using up a lot of power. So if we were in a workload that needed all the CPU power, that GPU is not going to be getting much of anything, and the CPU probably wouldn't even be able to reach its maximum all-core clock speed. Luckily, most games out there are not really multi-threaded, and most of them just run on 1, 2, maybe at most 4 cores. And as you can see here in Alien Isolation, the CPU usage is abysmally low, most of the time under 10%. And we're running the game at the ultra graphics settings, and we're actually able to get very close to a 60 FPS average. But the best part of all of this is how close those 1% loads are to our averages. That means that this is going to be a very smooth experience while playing through this game. And every time I've actually played this game on any of these mini PCs, I've been blown away by just how consistent the game is, especially because it's not a game that needs a high refresh rate. You could play this game perfectly fine at a locked 30 FPS. So being able to get this close to 60 on here is just a bonus, really, especially since we're running this with the ultra graphics settings. And while we're taking a look at Alien Isolation, we could start looking at some older titles here. And here you can see the original Tomb Raider remake running with the high graphics preset. We're actually able to get an FPS average of 64 with 1% lows of 52. That means you're going to be able to have a perfect gaming experience on here. It's going to be absolutely rock solid, and you're able to play this older title at a higher resolution with higher graphics settings than any console that was out at the time that this game was first coming out. And you would pretty much also have to have a pretty high-end PC to be able to keep up with it. So the fact that a mini PC like this is actually able to play the game perfectly fine at its high graphics settings is pretty nice to see. Of course, not all older titles are made the same, and here you can see Metro Last Light running with its built-in benchmark with the lowest in-game graphics settings, and we're getting an FPS average of 55 with 1% lows of 37. Now, it isn't the most ideal level of performance, especially for a title this low, considering that we're running this with the lowest in-game graphics settings, but just look at this built-in benchmark, and even with the lowest settings, you can see that the game is extremely detailed, and it's still one of the best looking games of its era. So you can see how demanding it could realistically be, especially since this is the lowest. We can turn things up even more from here. It just ends up really murdering our level of performance, at least on this system. But even with the lowest settings, it still looks extremely beautiful. I absolutely love this series. And in general, being able to play the game like this on this system is actually just an absolute win. Here you can see Shadow of Mordor running with the lowest in-game graphics settings, also at 1080p, and the level of performance that we get here is adequate enough. 58 FPS average with 1% lows of 47 means that you're going to have a very consistent experience here, though not a high refresh rate one. But if you really want those high refresh rates, you can't always drop down to 900p. It's just not necessary here. I think that this is more than playable enough as it is right now. Now, BioShock Infinite is a title that you're going to be able to actually play with some pretty high refresh rate here, if you're willing to go down to some of the lower graphics settings. But even with the very high graphics preset, an FPS average of 52 with 1% lows of 40 means that you're getting a very consistent experience, and you are running this at close to the highest graphics settings. I didn't go with the ultra graphics just because that really would have tanked FPS, and I just cannot visually tell a difference. But in general here, you could still drop things down to high or to medium if you want to boost that FPS to consistently above 60. But in general, it looks gorgeous like this. The art style of the game has aged beautifully, and being able to play a title this good on a system this cheap is just an icing on top. But like I said, not all games are made equally, and here you have Sleeping Dogs running with the medium in-game graphics settings. And with medium, we're actually able to get 87 for our FPS average, and our 1% lows are 63. With that said, though, this is at medium. If we go up to high, then it actually ends up being well below under 60. So medium is the way to go. The game still looks visually fantastic, though nowadays the definitive edition is what is out, so I don't even think you can get the original, and I'm pretty sure the developers that made it went out of business, which is unfortunate because I love this game, and the fact that we're not getting a Sleeping Dogs 2 breaks my heart. But moving on to some DirectX 9 titles, here we have Borderlands 2 running with a mixture of medium and high graphics settings. For the most part, things are set to high, only certain things are dropped down to medium. But at these graphics settings, we are able to get a 52 FPS average with 1% lows of 36. Not the most ideal levels of performance, in all honesty, for a title like this. I would have hoped to have seen an above 60 FPS average, but it is still decent enough that you're going to be able to play this perfectly fine. And you can just turn down a few things if you want to boost your FPS to be above 60. And here is Hard Reset, a title that you might not have ever heard of, but you might actually own. It's one of those games that gets bundled all the time. It's an older style single player FPS game, and it's actually really fun. I've played through it quite a few times, and you can even get like a Redux version that is essentially an HD remaster. It just does not have the built-in benchmark. So with the original game here, at the highest in-game graphics settings, but with AA set to FXAA instead of super sampling AA, we're able to get an FPS average of 72 with 1% lows of 45. So an absolutely perfect experience. And for the last game that we're taking a look at here is Resident Evil 5, running with the highest in-game graphics settings with 8 times AA. Now this isn't super sampling AA, so it's not like we're running this at 8 times the resolution like what Hard Reset was trying to do, but it is still a very aggressive AA setting, and you can actually boost your FPS more if you drop down the AA setting down to like 2x or 4x. But in all honesty, there's just no reason to do that. The FPS that you're getting here is just going to be perfectly fine for playing the game, and the edges of everything do look really nice. There's no aliasing that you see on the screen or anything, but it is a very dated title at this point. In general though, what this shows is that this mini PC is just really great at playing some of these older classic titles and some lighter modern games. But more recent AAA titles, you're looking at more of a 30 FPS gaming average, and that's even when you drop down to like 900p. So 900p and 720p seem to be the future of this APU for now, but if you're looking to play older titles or do emulation or anything like that, you can actually get 1080p or even higher resolutions than that. With that said, after testing all of those specific games on this system, all I can really say is that while I really love it, I think that for the vast majority of people out there, at the price point that this was hitting at and where you'll find similar systems out there, not this specific Beelink one, since that one actually ended up getting discontinued and replaced with the version with the 5800H, I would recommend going for that instead. If you could get yourself the 5800H, you do get a meaningful upgrade to this thing, and it's not even going to be more expensive than what this was selling for. As for where it stands in comparison to the rest of the market, well, we're going to have to see that once we fully compare it with all the others, but so far its biggest advantage is just the fact that it can have consistently higher 1% lows. But we'll see how it fully stacks up against all the other systems that I have next time. So if you're interested in seeing that, let me know down below and leave a like on this video. I'll catch you in the next one.